Okay, so we are public now, and I am going to move Marisol to attendee. And Elizabeth, I'm moving now to be an attendee. Did that work? I don't see you as, I see you both, you have your second email as attendee now. Okay, excellent.
Yeah, I was checking the other computer. Yes, it's there.
Okay, excellent. So we'll just wait until 12 o'clock to get started and welcome anybody who has joined us as attendees. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so we'll get started. Gracias por asistir a la reunión pública virtual del programa de evaluación de terrenos contaminados en la comunidad de Kingston. Thank you for joining the City of Kingston's community-wide brownfield assessments program in our virtual public meeting. My name is Kristen Wilson. I'm the Director of Grants Management, and I will be moderating the meeting today, and I'm currently managing this program. Live interpretation of the meeting will be available in Spanish, and our interpreter, Marisol Hernandez, will explain how to utilize the interpretation feature in Zoom. Mi nombre es Kristen Wilson, Directora de Gestión de Fondos por la Ciudad de Kingston, y administro este proyecto. Voy a moderar la reunión hoy. Podrán escuchar la interpretación en vivo en español, y el intérprete Marisol Hernández explicará cómo pueden utilizar la función de interpretación en Zoom. So, la interpretación comenzará ahora. Okay, go ahead, Marisol. And you have to unmute.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Marisol, and I will be interpreting today's meeting from English into Spanish with Elizabeth. We are members of CMY Latino. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Marisol y yo voy a interpretar esta reunión del inglés al español con Elizabeth. Somos miembros de CMY Latino. We'll be using the Zoom interpretation function. It's for everyone who isn't comfortable in both English and Spanish. Vamos a usar la función de interpretación de Zoom. Es para todos aquellos que no se sienten cómodos en inglés o en español. And now we'll give a quick overview of how to access the interpretation function. Y ahora vamos a dar un breve resumen de cómo acceder la función de interpretación. The interpretation function has been activated. You will see a globe icon on the bottom right of your screen. La función de interpretación ha sido activada. Usted puede ver un icono o un globo en la parte de abajo de su computadora. If you are joining with a tablet or a phone, click on More and click on Language Interpretation. Si estás conectando con un teléfono celular o una tableta, haga un clic en More y seleccione Interpretation Language. Simply choose your language channel. Simplemente seleccione el canal que desea usar del lenguaje que usted quiere, ya sea inglés o español. There's no an option to mute original audio, in which case you will no longer hear the presenter's voice under the interpretation. Hay la opción de silenciar el audio original. En dado caso, usted no quiere escuchar el audio de los presentadores abajo de la interpretación. We're listening to consecutive interpretation now, and I will start simultaneous interpretation in a few moments. Estás escuchando interpretación consecutiva ahora, que es lo que estamos haciendo, y comenzaremos interpretación simultánea en un momento. If you still cannot see the globe, a recording of the meeting in Spanish will be available on YouTube tomorrow. Don't suffer in silence. Please connect with us. We will start simultaneous translation now, and Elizabeth will be interpreting while I speak. Vamos a empezar la interpretación simultánea ahora y Elizabeth va a traducir todo lo que yo digo. Now, let's do a quick check. To make sure the function is working. Creating a JAWS multi-language space is a shared responsibility. Language includes the right for everyone to communicate in our own language and a respect for the language rights for all people. Equitable communication in bilingual space is a shared responsibility among all of us. Here is what you can do to help. And this will help us now. You look out for communications from the logistics support person or interpreters in case they need to ask you to pause or to speak more slowly and demonstrate a hand signal. So if I do this, please slow down. That means you're speaking too fast and the interpreter could not translate. Speak at a moderate pace and pause often, especially between speakers or between languages, and especially when reading text. It's impossible to interpret when more than one person speaks at a time. So if we hear more than one voice, you will see us use the hand signal. Si escuchamos muchos, if we hear more than one. Tech person, please activate the second interpreter.
Okay, so I will activate the second interpreter now, which is Marisol. So Marisol and Elizabeth will be in the Spanish station. Hey, Marisol, can you just say something to make sure you're in Spanish?
Can you hear me now? ¿Me
I
puedes oír? I'm not.
Okay, let me try you again. Try that again. Okay, go ahead.
It's
Now, Elizabeth and Marisol are both in Spanish, and if you would like to view this in Spanish, please go to the bottom and click on the globe button and choose your language. So before we begin the meeting, I just will go over a few meeting guidelines to help us navigate this virtual meeting as efficiently as possible. Members of the public are attendees and are muted for the duration of the presentation. During the presentation, questions can be answered into the Q&A function down at the bottom. And at the end of the meeting, we'll have a period of time to answer questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A icon. Please click there to ask questions about the presentation. There's also a chat icon that is really only for technical questions having to do with the webinar itself. Questions may be also entered into the Q&A function in Spanish, and we will aim to answer them in Spanish as well. During the Q&A session at the end, we may also allow people to raise their hands, and we may be able to unmute you to ask a question verbally, and you can do that in both Spanish or English. If people have a technical difficulty, please write about it in the chat. One of our city staff members will try to help you, but in the event that your technical issue cannot be resolved during the meeting recording will be available in both Spanish and English on YouTube and on engagekingston.com afterwards. City and staff and presenters from Weston and Sampson will control their own mute button. And during the Q&A session, if a city staff or consultant wishes to speak, they'll raise their hands and I will call on them and state their name clearly for our video and audio listeners. This meeting is being recorded. Both video and written transcriptions will be made available later, as I mentioned earlier. And you can also submit comments about the project after the meeting to engagekingston.com/brownfields. And I'm going to put that into the chat right now. Let's see. So this is the website for any comments. And there are many unique engagement tools on the website to share your thoughts about the designs. And in particular, we have a discussion forum on Engage Kingston that we're using for the first time with this project. Lastly, at today's meeting, we have in attendance Mayor Steve Noble. And maybe you could just wave when I call your name. We have Ruth Ann Devitt Frank, Grants Manager. Kaylin Lochi from Weston and Sampson. Sarah De Stefano from Weston and Sampson. Hopefully I didn't say your name wrong. George Naslis from Weston and Sampson. And we also have Elizabeth Patino and Marisol Hernandez from CNY Latino. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your patience while listening to this introduction, and if we have technical difficulties throughout the meeting. And I also encourage you to share the recording of this meeting with your friends and neighbors in Kingston, and we would love to hear from as many voices as possible. I will now pass an introduction over to Mayor Steve Noble to say a few words about the program.
Thanks, Kristen. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to be able to have this be part of our culmination of our Brownfield project. Thanks to funding from the EPA, we received over $400,000 to be able to investigate properties around Kingston. As many folks know that over the years, land use has changed in Kingston, and not everyone was always such a good steward of our land. And so we were able to unfortunately find that some of our properties in and around Kingston were brownfields. And this grant provided us an opportunity to look more in depth at the history of some of these properties, as well as what some of the contaminants may be or are on properties located in the Midtown area of Kingston and in downtown Kingston. In this case, knowledge is power. It helps to provide guidance for city government, but it also helps to provide guidance for neighbors and those looking to redevelop properties in and around Kingston so that we know what we're dealing with and we know how to move forward with positive strategies to be able to get these properties cleaned up and back into the hands of much better stewards than back in a long time ago. And so I really want to just take a moment to thank Weston and Sampson for the work that you've done over the last few years on this project, and to our advisory committee who helped along the way to bring this project to fruition. And so with that, I look forward to learning more about what was learned during this process. But I would say that our Engage Kingston website does have a lot of details about the individual properties. And so if you do have further follow-ups, that's a really great resource that I really encourage you to utilize. And so with that, Kristen, I'm going to throw it back over to you, I think. I think you're muted there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay, great. Sarah will be sharing her screen now, and I believe Kaylin, well, I may be sharing about some of the screens, and then I think Kaylin will take over, correct? Yes, okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have Mayor Steve Noble, myself, Kaylin Lochi, Sarah Di Stefano, and George Naslis from Weston and Sampson presenting today with interpretation by Marisol Hernandez and Elizabeth Patino. So Weston and Sampson is our consultant for this project. They're specialists in brownfields and environmental assessment. And I am going to pass it to Kaylin to share more about what brownfields are and what our goals were for this program.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Mayor Noble. And thank you to all who have taken the time to attend today's webinar. We have a lot of exciting information to cover, so I'm just going to jump right in. Some of you may be familiar with Kingston's Brownfield program, but for those of you who aren't, I'd like to start with a quick overview of what brownfields are. So the EPA defines a brownfield as a real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So brownfields can be anything from industrial or commercial sites, such as manufacturing facilities or foundries, to abandoned or underutilized, unused properties, former residential dwellings. So the key is that these sites have or may have environmental issues that may prevent or complicate reuse or redevelopment. Next slide, please. So if you really think about it, brownfields are just great opportunities. Redeveloping brownfields helps to remove blight. It can help create jobs. It can encourage smart growth and promote economic redevelopment. They can enhance the quality of life and community pride. It can create affordable housing options. They can create a safer and healthier place to live, work, and play. They can leverage additional investments. There's some tax benefits or tax incentives associated with it. They can remove stigma, uncertainty, and address unknowns. And they can increase property values and marketability. The picture that you see here is a site in Massachusetts that was a former silversmith facility along this riverfront. An EPA brownfield funding was used to assess and redevelopment the site. You see the after picture on the right-hand side. It was redeveloped into a boat ramp and a linear park. So you can see they're a gem in the rough. You just need to kind of polish them, and it brings all these opportunities to the table. Next slide, please. So Kingston completed a lot of work through their Brownfields Opportunity Area Program, which is also called the BOA program. And they want to build off those previous successes. So they established some goals that they want to achieve through their Brownfield program. And some of those goals included enlarging the tax base of the city, encouraging mixed use, mixed land use and water related uses. They wanted to allow for smart growth-based economic development and create living wage jobs. They want to optimize the waterfront properties and water-based activities. And they want to invest in a range of housing opportunities and establish walkable waterfronts and shoreline communities. So it's important to note that these goals aren't met overnight. It's a long-term process. And some of the goals may get reprioritized and focus may shift during the process and additional goals may be added. But it's all based on the community's needs and the public's input. So overall, Kingston is striving to meet these goals through the Brownfield grant, as it will hopefully facilitate redevelopment. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the city wanted to build on its successes from the Brownfield Opportunity Area Program, BOA program. So it applied for the EPA's community-wide Brownfields Assessment Program, which addresses many critical needs of the community. So in 2018, EPA awarded the city a $400,000 hazardous substance and petroleum assessment grants. The grant expires this September 30th, and most of the funds have already been used. So a lot of work has been completed under this grant over the last 3+ years, and I'll detail out what has been done in a little bit. The grant focused mainly on the city's waterfront area, as well as the Midtown area, with intent to spur economic development for sites that have the highest potential to achieve Kingston's redevelopment goals and the smart growth revitalization. The Brownfield grant also aligns perfectly with Kingston's master plan, as well as the Brownfields Opportunity Area Plan. Next slide, please. So this is a flow chart that gives a brief overview of what the EPA Brownfield program includes. You can see this first blue arrow. This is the planning and community involvement phase. So during this phase, we hold a kickoff meeting to discuss things like project objectives. We establish advisory committee or a steering committee. We discuss the project schedule. We review available resources. We update the inventory of potential sites that we want to assess. And that's when we start the public outreach and engagement. The second arrow is the inventory and site selection phase. So in that phase, we conduct an inventory of potential sites and we prioritize those sites. So this is the phase in which the city decided they wanted to focus in on the waterfront area as well as the Midtown area. This is the phase where the EPA determines the site eligibility. So once a site is eligible for assessment, we come down to the site assessment phases. So the first phase is to complete a phase 1, which is a kind of a desktop preliminary review. It also includes a site inspection, and we'll get into that. And phase 1s can lead to a phase 2 environmental site assessment. And the phase 2s include a quality assurance project plan, as well as a health and safety plan. That's when you actually do some sampling on site. It can also include hazardous building material surveys. And once you have the results of the phase 2, you can use those results to move on to this last phase, which is the reuse and cleanup planning phase. And that's where you take a look at the site's reuse options. You do an analysis of the brownfield cleanup alternatives, and you put together some cost estimates based on what those alternatives may be. And then while that's all going on, you've got this green box up here. That's the continuing programmatic support. So that's basically the project management and the reporting back to EPA. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, creating an inventory of the potential sites is one of the first steps. So Kingston started with reviewing their existing resources and inventory. And potential sites that can be assessed include abandoned or blighted properties, former industrial properties, properties that can be taken due to tax delinquencies, involuntary acquired properties, sites that continuously pop up on regulatory databases, sites that have the best chances for redevelopment, or just any sites where there is a developer interested. Next slide, please. So Kingston started with their inventory list, and there was about 16 sites on the original list. Several were added over the last couple of years, and things, sites were reprioritized several times. So Kingston submitted their initial list to the EPA and to determine if those sites were eligible for assessment. And basically that process consists of completing an eligibility form. It's submitted to the EPA. The EPA reviews it. They run through their general eligibility criteria, and if all the boxes can be checked, they determine if the assessment can be covered under the Hazardous Substance Fund or the Petroleum Fund. And that's determined by the potential contaminants are on site. To be eligible, sites cannot be the subject of planned or ongoing removal actions. They cannot be listed or proposed for a listing on the National Priorities List or Superfund list. They cannot be the subject of an administrative or court order under solid or hazardous waste laws. They cannot be the subject of corrective actions or closure requirements, and they cannot be a federal facility. And the goal of the eligibility screening process is to ensure that the party that created the environmental contamination pays for the cleanup in the end. So once the site is determined eligible, then you can start the phase 1 process. So this figure here just kind of shows the initial list of 16 sites that we requested eligibility for. Next slide, please. Okay, so phase 1s. Phase 1s are preliminary screening that generally consist of a site visit, a review of municipal, historical, state, and federal regulatory files, and they're used to determine the past uses of a site. And they evaluate any reported, and there's an evaluation of any reported releases of petroleum or other hazardous materials. And the end goal of phase 1 is really to identify any recognized environmental conditions, which we call REC. So this information is used to write a report, which identifies what type of contamination is on site, potentially on site, and it identifies where on site it's likely to be. Recommendations are usually made in phase 1, and if needed, a phase 2 investigation is typically recommended, and that's based on the phase 1 findings. There's typically no environmental and we completed 8 phase 1s under the Brownfield grant, Kingston, and I'll get to those details in a bit. Next slide. Okay, so if a phase 1 identifies potential contamination, then a phase 2 environmental site assessment is recommended and completed. So phase 2 typically includes the sampling of soil, sampling of groundwater, sampling of sediment, soil vapor, whatever the media is that may be affected. Those samples are then analyzed by a lab. This picture shows a typical geoprobe rig that is used to collect the soil and groundwater samples. A phase 2 may also include a hazardous building material survey. So that's a collection of asbestos-containing materials, lead-based paint, or PCBs. So a phase 2 is basically completed to confirm if contamination is present and to give a better idea of the nature and extent of the contamination. And the findings of the phase 2 are ultimately used to help develop the cleanup and reuse plans. So one thing I also want to point out is that even though phase 2s are completed under this grant, under an EPA program, they still need to stay in compliant with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation regulations and requirements. So for example, if contamination is identified during the investigation under the EPA grant, and like I said, if contamination is identified, we not only have to let the EPA know, but we also need to report that information to the DEC, and typically a spill will be assigned. Next slide, please. Okay. So if contamination is found in the soil or the groundwater during a phase 2, we look to the New York State regs and requirements for comparison purposes and cleanup guidance. So for comparison in soil, for concentrations in soil, we compare the results to soil cleanup objectives in Part 375 standards. And the cleanup objectives are based on the future use of the site. So there's a set of standards that the soil needs to meet if the site is being used for, let's say, farming and crops. That would be considered unrestricted use. There's a set of standards that the soil needs to meet if the future use will be residential, or if it's going to be a recreational park, they need to meet restricted residential soil cleanup objectives. Same thing for commercial use, and same thing for industrial. So there's different sets of standards based on the future use. Groundwater, thankfully, isn't as complicated. The groundwater results are compared to one set of standards, which is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Technical and Operational Guidance Series, or TOGS. So under the Brownfield grant, the city completed 8 phase 1s throughout the Midtown and waterfront areas. And 4 of those phase 1s led to phase 2s. And out of the 4 phase 2s, hazardous building material surveys were completed. So the 4 phase 2s were selected because the city intends to allow redevelopment of those sites for residential and or commercial use through the Restore New York program. So this map shows the sites in relation to each other. We've got the Midtown district, where the clump of sites are to the left of the page, and then the waterfront district to the right. And it should be noted that all of these properties where the phase 1s and phase 2s were completed are owned by the city, which they obtained through tax delinquency. So now I'll dive into the details of the phase 1 and phase 2 assessments that were completed. First, I'll discuss the sites where just the phase 1s were completed, and then I'll move on to the sites where the phase 1 and phase 2s were completed. So the first site where we completed a phase 1 was 197 225 North Street. This site is vacant. It's heavily wooded. It's about 10 acres and contains no structures and zoned commercial. There's no history of development on site and no history of high-risk environmental uses. Currently, it's used for recreational purposes by local residents, such as ATV use and hiking. The environmental records review did not reveal any listings that were considered to present an environmental risk to the site. So the phase 1 conclusions were that there was no recognized environmental conditions or vapor encroachment conditions, which is a presence or likely presence of chemicals that concern vapors in the subsurface caused by a release of vapors from contamination. So this is a pretty clean site. There was, like I said, there was no major red flags. There was no recommendation for additional investigation to be completed at this site. Next slide, please. So second site we completed a phase 1 at was 124 Franklin Street. This site is developed with about a 2,000 square foot residence that was built in 1893. No high-risk uses identified for this property or the surrounding properties since they were all residential dating back to the 1880s. The site is currently vacant. The database review indicated that oil and oil-impacted soil from an abandoned above-ground storage tank at the site was removed and disposed of in 2012. The DEC was involved in that. There was an environmental consultant oversight. So the spill was addressed and spill was closed. The database also review indicated that there were drums reportedly containing waste oil that were buried at an adjacent property to the east. There was no indication that these drums were removed or remediated. So the site could be impacted by these drums, which is this is considered a recognized environmental condition at this site. So there is a potential that a release from those drums could have impacted vapor on this site also. So we also considered that a vapor encroachment condition. So based on the age of the building, there's potential for hazardous building materials like asbestos, lead-based paint, or PCB caulk. So our recommendation for this property was to complete a phase 2 and a hazardous building material survey. Next slide, please. The third property we completed a phase 1 at was 38 Post Street. This site was developed with a 1,500 square foot commercial building. It's currently vacant. It's been vacant since 2012. It's basically storing a lot of garbage and unused construction material right now. We found some unlabeled drums in the basement. It was first developed in the 1890s and was historically used as the boiler house for the Kingston Laundry Facility, which is located next door. Records indicate that there was 2 underground storage tanks that were closed in place in 1997. And there has been a release of a chlorinated solvent called tetrachloroethylene, or PCE, PERC, that was identified in 2005. There was subsequent subsurface investigation that was performed. DEC was involved in that. They determined that additional investigation was needed, and they classified this site as Class P site, which means potential registered site within the New York State Hazardous Waste Program, or Superfund site. So additional investigation was recommended by the DEC, but was never completed to date. So that we identified as a recognized environmental concern. And obviously there's potential that that release of the PCE containing oil could have impacted the vapor on site. So we also considered this, consider that a vapor encroachment condition. Based on the age of the building, there's potential for hazardous building materials such as asbestos, lead-based paint, and PCB caulk. So for this phase 1, we recommended a phase 2 be completed, as well as a hazardous building material survey. Next slide, please. So 78 Franklin Street. We are in the midst of completing a phase 1 right now. We completed the site inspection and a records review, and we are wrapping up the phase 1 report for this site. So I can't provide any details until the report's been reviewed by the city and the EPA and it's been finalized, but keep an eye out for that one. It'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And we'll talk about where you can access all these reports towards the end of the presentation. So 33 Franklin, this was one of the sites where we completed a phase 1, which led to a phase 2. So I'll start with the phase 1 information. This was developed in 1908 with a residence. No high-risk uses identified for the site or the surrounding sites because they were all residential back to the 1880s. It's currently vacant. The database review indicated that 2 nearby sites down the street, 45 Franklin and 54 Franklin, are listed for fuel oil releases of an unknown quantity. So the site could be impacted by these releases, which we considered a recognized environmental condition. There's also potential that those releases could have impacted the vapor on site. So we also considered that a vapor encroachment condition. Based on the age of the building, there is the potential for hazardous building materials. So we recommended a phase 2 and a hazardous building material survey. Next slide. So we completed a phase 2, which included 3 soil borings that were installed by Geoprobe. The borings were converted into 3 ground monitoring wells. We sampled shallow soil within the first 2 feet, 0 to 2 feet around the perimeter of the site building using a hand auger. Soil samples were analyzed for volatile organic compounds, VOCs, semi-volatile organic compounds, SVOCs, and metals. And we completed 2 rounds of groundwater samples back in June 2019 and November 2019, and we analyzed the groundwater samples for VOCs and SVOCs. And we also completed a hazardous building material survey to identify any presence of asbestos-containing material, PCBs, lead-based paint. Next slide, please. So this shows the soil results for this property. Shallow soils around the perimeter of the building were impacted by lead, but deeper soils, the subsurface soils, there was no exceedances. So if you remember, I discussed that we compared to the DEC soil cleanup objectives based on the future use. So the yellow boxes, the yellow highlighted boxes exceed the unrestricted use, and the orange boxes exceed the residential use. So in those areas, you can see where lead exceeds unrestricted use as well as residential use. So the recommendations we made for this site are that the soil around the building that's impacted with lead, which is most likely from the historical use of lead paint on the exterior of building. They're probably superficial impacts only. This soil should be removed and properly disposed of during any redevelopment activities. And then confirmation sampling should be performed to confirm that the full extent of impacted soils has been removed. Next slide, please. Groundwater results indicated that elevated levels of tetrachloroethylene, PC, and trichloroethylene, TC, were detected in the groundwater. So based on these groundwater concentrations, which you can see here where they exceeded the TOGS values, New York State DEC TOGS values. Based on those concentrations, we had to notify the DEC of the results, and the DEC assigned a spill number to this site. So the groundwater at most of these sites was around 20 feet deep, 20 feet below the surface. So because there was presence of the TC and the PC in the groundwater and it was absent in the soils above it, it's presumed that the TC and the PC concentrations are migrating onto this site. Based on the groundwater flow direction, the historical use of the site as a residence, and groundwater results that we were able to review from nearby properties that other companies had completed investigations there, it appears that there's a larger PC-TC plume in this area coming from an offsite source. So as far as the groundwater recommendations go, we think it's pretty evident that the concentrations are coming from an offsite source. So we recommended that we share these results with the DEC, which we did, to assist them in identifying where that source is. So the DEC reviewed the results and they closed the spill associated with this site, and they're using this data in conjunction with data collected at other nearby sites to determine where that PC-TC source is and the plume size. We also shared the findings with EPA's REPRA compliance branch to inspect the potential upgrade sources of PC-TC contamination. And we also recommend moving forward to assess the potential for vapor intrusion into the site building from known VOC contamination within the groundwater prior to redevelopment activities. As far as the hazardous building material survey goes, we identified asbestos containing material, lead-based paint, non-hazardous PCB containing material, and a universal waste item in the building. So our recommendations as far as the hazardous building material go was to cordon off the building, so so there was no access to the building, and apply proper signage to notify trespassers or any kind of site visitors that asbestos containing material exists on site. We also recommended that asbestos containing material and lead-based paint, that they'll need to be handled in compliance with any applicable laws or regulations prior to demolition or renovation activities. I'm sorry, the site is not actually going to be demoed, but renovated. And that there was a asbestos disturbance in the basement, which will require a contamination assessment and a site-specific variance that will need to be developed to submit to the Department of Labor to allow for cleanup and abatement of the asbestos containing material. And then obviously any kind of universal waste that was identified, that should be removed, packaged, transported, and recycled in accordance with all appropriate regulations. Next slide, please. Okay, so 4446 Franklin Street. We completed a phase 1 there, and this site is developed with a 2,500 square foot residential duplex, which was built in 1905. There were no high risks uses identified with this site or surrounding sites, as they all were residential back to the 1880s. It's currently vacant. The database review here indicated that 2 nearby sites, same as 33 Franklin, are listed for the fuel oil releases of unknown quantities. So this site could be impacted by those releases. We considered that a recognized environmental condition. There's the potential that those releases could have impacted the soil vapor on site. So that's considered a vapor encroachment condition. And based on the age of the building, there's potential for hazardous building materials. So we recommended a phase 2 and a hazardous building material survey for this site. So the phase 2 here included 1 soil boring that was installed by a geoprobe. That boring was converted to a monitoring well. We had proposed additional borings, but we couldn't access certain areas of the property, so we were only limited to the 1 boring. But we did sample the shallow soil, the first 2 feet around the perimeter of the building using a hand auger. The soil samples were analyzed for VOCs, SVOCs, and metals. We collected 2 rounds of groundwater samples in June 2019 and November 2019, and those samples were analyzed for VOCs and SVOCs. And we completed a hazardous building material a survey for this site as well. Next slide, please. So results for the phase 2. Shallow soil around the perimeter of the building is impacted with lead, and on this figure you can see where it exceeds the unrestricted use values as well as the residential. There were no exceedances though detected in the subsurface soils. The chlorinated VOCs, the PC and TC that was detected at the nearby upgrading site at 33 Franklin were not detected here, so that was good. The hazardous building assessment identified asbestos containing material, lead-based paint, universal waste in the building. So our recommendations here included that the soil around the building that is impacted with lead, again, most likely from the use of lead-based paint on the exterior of the building, and it's probably superficial. This soil should be removed and properly disposed of during redevelopment activities. And then confirmation sampling should be performed to confirm the removal of the full extent of the impacted soil. The ACMs, or the asbestos containing material, and lead-based paint will need to be handled in compliance with all applicable regulations during future redevelopment activities. And any identified universal waste should be handled, packaged, transported, and recycled in accordance with regulations. Next slide, please. 54 Van Dusen Street. We completed phase 1 and phase 2 here. The phase 1 indicated it was developed with residents back around 1900. No high risk uses were identified for this site or the surrounding sites, as they were all residential dating back to the 1880s. The site is currently vacant. During the inspection, 2 barrels that were in pretty poor condition containing a white powder substance were observed. So that was considered a recognized environmental condition. There was also a 275-gallon leaking fuel oil above ground storage tank that was observed in the basement. That was also considered a recognized environmental condition. The database review indicated that nearby sites are considered high-risk operations, including an auto repair shop that was historically a manufacturing facility, and then 2 former gas stations nearby. So releases may have occurred due to those high-risk uses and may have migrated to the site and could have impacted the site. So that was considered a recognized environmental condition. There's potential for those releases to have impacted the vapor on site, so we consider that a vapor encroachment condition. And then based on the age of the building, potential for hazardous building materials, asbestos, lead-based paint, PCB caulk. So the phase 1 results, we recommended a phase 2 and hazardous building material survey. So the phase 2 that we conducted at 54 Van Dusen included 3 soil borings that we installed with a geoprobe. The borings were converted to ground monitoring wells. We sampled the shallow soil around the perimeter of the building, as well as under the basement slab using a hand auger. And we did that because of the leaking above ground storage tank in the basement. We collected a subslab vapor sample for volatile organic compounds because of the leaking tank observed in the basement. The soil samples were analyzed for VOCs, SVOCs, metals. Groundwater samples were analyzed for VOCs, SVOCs. And again, we did 2 rounds of groundwater sampling in June and November 2018. And we completed a hazardous building material survey to identify any asbestos containing material, PCBs, lead-based paint. Next slide, please. So the results of the Van Dusen phase 2 include shallow soil around the perimeter. Again, is impacted with lead, and then in 1 location with mercury. However, there was no exceedances of these metals or any other compounds detected in the subsurface soils. The groundwater results indicate metals and PCE were detected. However, those concentrations were all below the guidance values, so that was good. Soil vapor screening indicated several low-level VOCs are present within the soil gas below the basement floor, which is most likely associated with the leaking tank in the basement. That has since been removed. The hazardous building material assessment identified lead-based paint, universal waste in the building. So our recommendations for this site include the removal of the soil, the shallow soil that's impacted by the lead and mercury. Those concentrations are most likely associated with the lead paint of the exterior building. The soil should be removed, properly disposed of during redevelopment activities, and then confirmation sampling should be performed to confirm that everything has been removed. We also recommended assessing the potential for soil vapor in the site building during redevelopment. The lead-based paint will need to be handled in compliance with all applicable laws and during future redevelopment activities at the site. And the universal waste should be handled, packaged, transported in accordance with regulations. Next slide, please. All right, so 615 Broadway completed phase 1 and phase 2 here. This site is it's a little less than an acre commercial property. It was developed currently as a parking lot. There's no buildings on site. Historically, though, it was developed in 1880 with residences, then in 1970s with a motel. And so there's no real high-risk former uses at the site. There are several high-risk properties nearby, though. There's a gas station, scrap metal yard, manufacturing, dry cleaning, a bowling alley. So releases associated with those properties may have migrated and impacted this site, which is considered a recognized environmental condition. The database review for this site indicated several releases have occurred at nearby and upgradient properties, including known spills from the nearby gas station, 2 fuel oil releases, and a chlorinated solvents release. And these could impact this site, which we considered a recognized environmental condition. There's also the potential that those releases have impacted the soil vapor. So that is considered an environmental encroachment condition. So we recommended a phase 2 here. Next slide. So this phase 2 included 8 soil borings that we installed with the geoprobe. 6 of those borings were converted to monitoring wells. We sampled shallow soil across the site using a hand auger, and the soil samples were analyzed for VOCs, SVOCs, PCBs, and metals. And the groundwater samples were analyzed for VOCs, SVOCs, PCBs, and metals. Again, we did 2 rounds of groundwater sampling in June 2019 and in November 2019. So the results at this site indicate that there are the shallow soils in several locations across the site are impacted with metals. Those metals are mercury and or lead, but there's no exceedances within the subsurface soils. So you can see on this figure, there's some areas that exceed the unrestricted use, which is the yellow, and some areas that exceeded the commercial use, which is that red. And again, those are just in the surface soil, 0 to 2 feet. Next slide, please. We also had some exceedances of SVOCs in the shallow soil in 2 locations, but there was no exceedances in the subsurface soil. So based on the historic use of this site, which was residential, a motel, a warehouse, and the presence of contamination detected in soil are not expected to be related to historic uses. The metals in the VOCs are, they're ubiquitous contaminants in urban areas, so they're most likely related to diffuse or non-point source discharges and surficial runoff. So our recommendations for this site is to any areas where the shallow soil has been impacted with the lead or the mercury or the SVOCs, that soil should be removed and disposed of properly during redevelopment activities, and then confirmation sampling should be performed. Next slide. So as far as the groundwater at 615 Broadway goes, we detected elevated levels of the PC and TC here as well. And based on those groundwater concentrations, we had to reach out to the DEC and notify them of the results. They issued a spill number to this site. But again, because the TC and the PC, it was detected in the groundwater, but it was absent in the soils above the groundwater. So it's presumed that the TC and PC is migrating onto the site from an off-site source. So based on the flow direction, the historic use of the site, and groundwater results from other investigations completed by nearby sites, there appears to be a larger plume in this area coming from an off-site source. So our groundwater recommendations included sharing these groundwater results with the DEC, which we did, to help them identify that off-site source. The DEC reviewed the results and they closed the spill associated with the site, but they're using this data in conjunction with other data collected at nearby sites to determine where that source and the plume size. The findings were also shared with EPA's RECA compliance branch to inspect the potential upgrade sources of the PC and TC contamination. And we also recommend assessing the potential for vapor intrusion into any future buildings due to the VOC contamination within the groundwater as part of redevelopment activities. Next slide, please. So what do we do with all this information that we gathered during the phase 1 and phase 2 assessments? Well, it's used to help plan the cleanup and reuse of the brownfield sites. So the cleanup and reuse planning includes, discussing and flushing out existing and potential future use scenarios, evaluating different cleanup and remediation options. It's also used to put together cost estimates of the cleanup alternatives and put together conceptual reuse planning and visioning. So this step, like I said, the grant is coming to an end soon. So this step will take place with future funding, since the remaining funds under this grant are earmarked to finish phase 1 for 78 Franklin and a possible phase 2 for 78 Franklin. So next steps, next slide, please. So the next steps is to solicit feedback from you guys, from the public. We want the public's feedback on potential future use scenarios. Are there potential brownfield sites that you would like to see assessed or redeveloped? We want to know, what factors are most important when selecting or prioritizing these sites for activities. And what's the community's redevelopment needs in general? Are there specific redevelopment needs for any of the sites that we already assessed? So feedback is greatly appreciated and welcomed, and you can provide that feedback through engagekingston.com website. One of the other task we need to complete is the phase 1 for 78 Franklin, and that will determine if a phase 2 is needed for that site. And lastly, the city will also be applying for future funding to assess and redevelop additional sites. It'll be used to further assess sites that need additional investigation. So some of those phase 1s where we recommended a phase 2, but it has been completed, that funding would be used towards that. Additional funding will also cover the cleanup and reuse planning phase for the sites that have been assessed under this grant. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just want to put up the engagekingston.com website. Please use this to give us your feedback. If you have any questions, you can use that website to put out your questions. Community members can find information about the Brownfields program, including the phase 1 reports and the phase 2 reports. And we want the public to ask questions and weigh in to help make the best decisions for the city's future. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen at this point.
Thank you, Kaylin. That was really great presentation and summarizes all of the hard work that all of you at Weston and Sampson have been doing over many years. And I really have just entered into this program at the end. So I'm really glad to have a comprehensive understanding of the program now. So I would like to open up our question and answer period now for the public. And so attendees may put questions into the Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and I will be able to allow you to speak. So let me see if I can figure that out here. Okay, so we have one question from Victor Capelli. I'm going to allow you to speak now. So Victor, I think you're able to speak now, and you'll just need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Great presentation, data-driven, data-rich. I only have one question. It's going to be kind of like a run-on sentence. The IBM site, has it ever been assessed by EPA and by any of your members of your engineering company as a potential site for any of these contaminants going into the Esopus Creek? Has the old IBM site, demolition site, been assessed for any kind of contamination into the groundwater and the subsoil?
It was not assessed under this grant, but that's not to say that it can't be added to lists, you know, the priorities list moving forward. I'm unaware of, I know Weston and Sampson has not investigated on that site, but there may be existing, you know, reports or investigation and investigative reports that have been completed by other companies. The best way to find that out is going to the DEC website probably and typing, you can type in the address and if they have information, it'll pop up on their spills database or their remediation database.
Okay, one follow-up question to that. The Esopus Creek, which is a meandering stream, which is considered to be an impaired stream,